Good afternoon. My name is Bob Elias, and as chairman of the Associated Students Speakers Program, I'd like to welcome you to our first lecture of the winter quarter. Today's speaker, Mr. Richard Armour, is a widely read writer of humor and satire. Mr. Armour received his PhD from Harvard and has since taught at such institutions as the University of Texas, Northwestern University, Wells College, the University of Hawaii, and the Claremont Graduate School, just to name a few. He has held research fellowships in England and France and lectured in Europe and Asia as an American specialist for the State Department. He served in the Army in both World War II and the Korean War, rising to the rank of colonel. Mr. Armour is, however, best known for his more than 6,000 pieces of light verse and even lighter prose that have appeared in over 200 magazines in the United States and England. He has authored 42 books, the most recent one being A Short History of Sex. Anyone who writes that many books will get around to that sooner or later. When Mr. Armour last appeared in UCLA, 1966, he had only 30 books to his credit. At this present rate of increase, he will, in a few years, have more books than Cotton Mather. Mr. Armour's topic today will be a safari into satire, and a short question and answer period will follow. It is my pleasure now to introduce Richard Armour.
Thank you very much. This referenced the number of my books and the rate of increase. I had never figured that out. It seems putting me along with the population explosion and everything else now. I'm right in tune with the times. I hope it isn't all quantity at the expense of quality, because I work hard at these things. The only thing I try to do is to remove any traces of work. I think one of the most important things about writing, no matter how difficult it is or how much you revise, and I usually revise a book about 5 times, retyping it always myself and making little additions and changes every time I type. I think no matter how much work there is in it, the writer should remove all the shavings and glue and traces of work. It should look easy. Now, I want to tell you in advance the most important thing a speaker can tell an audience, that is, I know when I'm supposed to finish, and I will finish then. But you don't know, perhaps, and if you don't, there's a slight tension between us and uncertainty, but I know, and I'll try to allow a little time for questions. I have a lot more to say than I'll have time to say it. I'm going to move along rather rapidly. I'm going to be very personal and intimate in what I have to say this morning, this noon. I'm going to give you not only the outlook, but the in-look of a writer of humor and satire. And so I'm going to start very intimately, and as intimately as I can. In other words, I'm going to start inside myself in a rather Guntherish way. Based on a news item I saw recently, to this effect: square spaghetti will soon be on the market. I wrote some lines on that as follows: were I as rich as J. Paul Getty and could eat steaks each meal, I still would like at times spaghetti, not for the taste, the feel. In San Francisco or New York, up north or in the south, I like to wrap it round my fork and lift it to my mouth. Much like a bird that eats a worm, I love to suck it in. I'm only glad it doesn't squirm or wriggle off my chin. This could be done when it was round, but now that it is square, I can't be certain I'll be bound, if I'll be more than fair, at wrapping up a yard or so and stowing it with pride. It may go down a little slow. I'm round, not square inside. So starting from this thank you. Starting from this very inside and intimate view, I want to go ahead now. Pull out of this if I can. I've used 2 words so far, the words satire and humor, and I find these are often misused and are misunderstood, and I'd like very quickly, if I can, to tell you what I think is the difference between these 2 words and all they represent. First of all, they are alike in one way. They are both involved in the sudden recognition of incongruity, the sudden recognition that something is a kilter, a miss, not as it should be. But humor and satire are quite different with regard to their purposes. The purpose of humor is to entertain and relax, and that's a very important and useful purpose. If any of you play golf, you know, for instance, it's impossible to play a decent game when you are tense. You must be relaxed. True of almost all sports. The purpose of satire, however, is quite different. The purpose of satire is to deflate, to debunk, to point out something that is wrong. Not to correct a wrong, but to point it out, leave it to others to correct. And it usually does this by exaggerating the wrong, making it more apparent than it was before. Still another way to distinguish between humor and satire is to say that satire is acid and humor is alkaline. Now, I would like to write straight satire, straight acid if I could, but I've learned I would very soon lose my reader. I want to keep my reader to the very end. And so I put in just enough of the alkaline of humor to keep my reader in this bath of acid of satire. I'm going to use both humor and satire this morning, maybe a little more humor and satire, and depends on something that very far from humorous in a sense, but is satirical that I hope I can get to at the end. So here's a little of the distinction, I think, and the similarity between humor and satire. Alike in their recognition of incongruity, different in their purposes. In 1962, I lived with my wife and daughter in a Zen Buddhist temple in Kyoto, Japan, for some months, and I wrote a series of articles for the Christian Science Monitor and some papers and magazines on Zen Buddhism and on various Japanese customs. I was interviewed by a reporter for the Tokyo Shinbun, the leading Japanese language paper, and afterwards I had this translated. And I found he'd said an extraordinary thing, a hard thing to believe perhaps, about satirists. He said that had Japan had even a single satirist before World War II to deflate the divine pretensions of the emperor on his white horse, bring down the ambitions of the Japanese warlords, Japan, he said, might not have been in World War II. Now that's a great claim to make for a satirist. But then he added, rather sadly, 1962, long after the war, there is still not a single satirist in Japan. Now, I've been back to Japan a number of times, most recently last year, and each time I ask, have you any satirists today? They usually say, so sorry, no satirists. Now, the reason, apparently, for this lack of satirists in Japan, and I read an article in Japan on this just last year, is that the Japanese have such reverence for their country, even the nature, the trees, the leaves, everything about their country, such reverence that they can't bear to do what the satirist has to do. Now, I've been thinking, ever since this, the fact that Japan is lacking in satirists, we have so many in this country, more than perhaps any place in the world. And we don't stop short, as they do in many places. I've read the Russian, I wrote a book, it all started with Marx, which keeps me out of Russia. It was, you know, a lot of people go to Russia and come back after 3 weeks and write a definitive work on Russia. I didn't go at all, which makes mine more objective perhaps than theirs. But it is in various foreign languages around the Iron Curtain, and it has been condemned by the government in language I can't repeat here, I shouldn't. But thinking of how many satirists we have and how we direct our sharpest satire not at the lower levels, as the Russians do now very much in Crocodile, at the supervisors, superintendents in factories, but not at Kosygin, Brezhnev, and so on, not earlier at Khrushchev, and certainly not earlier at Stalin. We aim our sharpest satire at our number one man, or more recently, number 1 and 2 men. So I've been thinking, because of this lack of satirists in Japan, that we should export satirists from America to Japan and trade them for Sony radios and Toyotas, Datsuns. It would help our balance in trade and would help me immeasurably in eliminating competition. Now, in my work, I deal largely with the minor imperfections of the human race. The major vices I leave to the philosophers the preachers, and the police. But I am actually happy, not just for my profession, but happy as a human being that we have these imperfections. If we didn't, we would be a dull lot indeed. In fact, we'd all be exactly alike. I think all that keeps us apart, gives us individuality, is the fact that we have these imperfections. I think human beings are just little packages of different combinations of imperfections. Now, a while ago, I read a statement to the effect that there is no laughter in heaven. The person who wrote that obviously had in mind that heaven is a perfect place. There are no imperfections, no incongruities, no absurdities to notice suddenly and therefore to give humor, laughter. Ever since I read that, I have been somewhat more reconciled to my own ultimate destination. I can imagine myself sitting around the fire, or possibly in the fire, with a group of friends, some of them no doubt from UCLA, all of us telling stories we couldn't tell any other place. Probably getting our subscription to Playboy, too. Now, there are two ways, I think, of writing humor and satire other than good and bad. One is to write in verse and the other in prose. Now, I do both, not at the same time, but I do both. And I have different reasons for using one time one and one the other. You might wonder why anyone would write anything in verse. I think there are two main reasons. One, verse is more condensed than prose. Sometimes it's possible in a line or 2 lines or a quatrain to say what would take a chapter of prose. The other reason is that I think verse is more memorable than prose. If you look in Bartlett's familiar quotations, for instance, you'll find that next to the Bible and Shakespeare, the person most quoted is Alexander Pope. Not one of the greatest poets, certainly, but he knew how to use the couplets, especially the heroic couplets, in a work like the Essay on Criticism. You'd think that would be in prose, but he chose to write it in verse and in couplets, knowing that couplets are probably the easiest verse to remember. If you remember the rhyme in one line, that helps you with the second line. The difference between I would say that condensation and memorability are 2 reasons for writing in verse. The difference between light verse and poetry, and you won't hear any poetry this morning, you'll be glad to know, but some light verse. The difference, I think, is largely in the fact that in poetry you have great thoughts and lofty images. You don't have these in light verse, so to make up for them, you use technique. You emphasize technique, largely in rhymes and meters. Emphasize them in a way, make them so obvious that would not ever be done by a serious poet. Let me give you an example of technique in light verse. This is a piece called The Extremely Common Cold. And originally, I had written what are now the last 2 lines. And I might have left them as a complete poem, as a couplet. But I get paid by the line. So I wrote about a dozen lines in front of these 2 lines, and I will signal you when we get to these 2 lines. Now, these lines, what the technique comes out in these lines is this. It's all in triple rhymes, 3-syllable rhymes. Now, our language is not rich in these, and a serious poet wouldn't fool around with it at all. But once you start with triple rhymes, you stay with it. So here it is. The extremely common cold, example of technique in light verse, use of triple rhymes. Of all the ills iniquitous, the cold is most ubiquitous. It comes to every national, to sane and to irrational, to debtor and to creditor, illiterate and editor, to indolent and dutiful, to ugly and to beautiful, to modest and to haughty folk, to pious and to naughty folk, to high as well as low degree, to college grad and no degree. And though you sneeze and cough a lot, it helps, though not an awful lot, to know that there's no preference regarding colds or deference, and even royal highnesses have trouble with their sinuses. For many years, I wrote for an editor in New York who graded, like a college professor, everything I submitted. And sometimes if he was hard up, he might even take a C or a C-. But only once in several years of writing for him did I get an A. And it was for this which I think is the epitome of technique in light verse. This has internal rhyme, a rhyme between a sound at the end of the line and the middle of the line. It has double rhymes, two-syllable rhymes in the second and fourth lines of each stanza. The thought goes around in a complete circle. And it's based on this news item. Up in Newfoundland, some 30 moose, mistaking diesel train horns for mating calls, had been lured to death on the tracks. And I called this the love life and death of a moose. Imagine this beast of the frozen Northeast with this annual amorous craze on, seduced by the toot of a choo-choo en route into making a fatal liaison. Conceive of its size as it straddles the ties, unaware of the killer it's dating. The honk of the train has gone straight to its brain, and its mind is completely on mating. Appalling, of course, but just think how much worse it would be, and no words shall we weasel, should an engine tear loose from its tracks when a moose makes what sounds like the call of a diesel. Now, I think a writer in any field is always in search of universal subjects, things that are interesting to people at all times and all places. And I too have sought this subject, and I'm going to give you that universal subject in a moment. But first, how about the entire human race? I've talked about the imperfection of the human race, which I write about. How did the human race get started? Well, I ran across a news item that gave me a clue to this. Item was, according to a new theory of evolution, man evolved from brown seaweed. Now, in conjunction with a biologist colleague of mine, I wrote a piece tracing man back step by step from his present state to brown seaweed, and that was published in the New Yorker. But what I wrote is much less important than what I discovered later. I read a little book by Harlow Shapley, the Harvard cosmologist, a book called Of Stars and Men, in which Professor Shapley brought to bear the knowledge of all the sciences, of astronomy and geology and chemistry and physics and biology and so on, brought all this knowledge to bear on the question of how did life, evolving into human life, begin. And he points out in that book that there is no chemical substance in the physical makeup of man and man's body which is unique to man, nothing which is not also to be found in the Earth's surface, the Earth's crust. And therefore he believes that life developing into human life began not with what we think of as living matter, not with brown seaweed, but with stones. He thinks that stones were pulverized, then moistened by rainwater, and then at the proper temperature, possibly 98.6, a flash of lightning came and life began. Now, ever since I read that, I've had an entirely new attitude toward stones. Now, when I stub my toe on a boulder, I say, I beg your pardon, because it might be a relative. And if you knew some of my relatives, you'd know how likely that is. In fact, in some instances, desirable. Now, about this universal subject, what is it? I think it's money. And I've written a number of pieces on it, but I think this is the most scholarly and thoroughgoing, entitled, by coincidence, Money. Workers earn it, spendthrifts burn it, bankers lend it, women spend it, forgers fake it, taxes take it, dying leave it, heirs receive it, thrifty save it, misers crave it, robbers seize it, rich increase it, gamblers lose it. I could use it. You might be interested to know that a few weeks ago I spoke at San Quentin Prison to a General Assembly, and I didn't read this piece in advance, but I read it to them. And as I read it, I noticed when I got the line, forgers fake it and robbers seize it, they were looking around at each other in a congratulatory way. I think the next subject in universality to money, and I'm afraid connected with it, is the battle of the sexes. a battle which I began to think was over, and I knew who had won until the women's lib started a new fracas. Now, I consider myself an authority on women. I have certain rather remarkable qualifications. For one thing, I taught for many years at a college for women, and I actually taught at another college for women before that and left voluntarily. Then I wrote a history of famous women. It all started with Eve. More recently, another book, My Life with Women. You might be interested to know that my publishers suggested if I could make a slight change in that title, we'd have much better sales. They said, if you'll just change it from My Life with Women to Women I Have Lived With. But my wife has been such a good sport about it, I let it stand there. Then most recently, just a couple of months ago, this short history of sex, which was referred to. We had some correspondence about this because Bob hadn't seen it, and he said, how can you write a short history of sex? It has to be a long history of sex. And I said, well, I might come out with a book called A Longing History of Sex. And we had quite a bit of interplay about that. This book, by the way, hasn't a single dirty word in it, but it's being read by an astonishing number of dirty people. This, I might say, makes me very happy. In a review of the book by the Philadelphia Bulletin, they said the government should have published this book instead of the report on pornography, that it would do more good and would cost the taxpayer less and use less paper. That's one of the finest reviews I've ever had of a book, comparing it favorably with a government document. I also am one of the few American professors who writes for Playboy. I've written almost since the magazine began, but I began to run out of subjects a couple of years ago. There was nothing apparently left that Playboy hadn't already covered or uncovered. And finally, in desperation, I wrote a piece about the elbow called Looking Over the Overlooked Elbow. Now, what intrigued me about the elbow as I began to study it in the way I study things is the fact that the elbow and the knee are joints that operate in the opposite direction. And if you just imagine reversing these two joints, you see what happens. If your elbow goes out this way and your knee comes up this way. For instance, a man couldn't shave himself with his... He'd have to go to the barber, and the barber couldn't shave him by looking at him directly. The barber would have to look into the mirror and shave him that way, see? Well, after this article came out, the magazine received a letter from Dr. Albert Ellis, who's probably the world's leading sexologist, written about 30 books in the field of sex. He wrote the magazine, he wrote me also. We had quite a bit of correspondence about this. It wasn't that he thought there was something wrong with me about my preoccupation with the elbow. He was chagrined as a psychologist and a sexologist at having overlooked the elbow as an erogenous zone. And he said to me, you may eventually become known as the father of the elbow. Now, all the things I've struggled in my life to do, and finally maybe to have this on my tombstone, it's remarkably. I do think in future issues of the magazine, though, someday, if this takes hold, you'll find in the centerfold girls with their elbows up and tassels from them, probably. I want to say this much more. There's so much I could say on this subject, even some of it in public. But I want to say just this, that probably in the battle of the sexes, once you have determined, and it's getting harder and harder, which sex is which, once you've determined that and know which you want to marry, if you're going to marry, if you're still that old-fashioned, the question is when to get married. And I once took care of this in some lines with an atrocious punning title, the kind we try so hard to achieve. It's called To Have and Too Old. And it opens with a gruesome Charles Adamish scene. The bride, white of hair, is stooped over her cane. Her faltering footsteps need guiding. While down the church aisle, with a wan, toothless smile, the groom in a wheelchair comes riding. And who is this elderly couple, you ask? You'll find when you've closely explored it that here is that rare, most conservative pair who waited till they could afford it. Or if you go on into on into this subject, into married life, into the period after the romance has gone out, after 6 months or so, you come to this situation. This is probably the highest intellectual reach I'll bring to you today, this item from the paper. By the way, let me say, I've used news items from the paper quite a bit. I think the American newspaper is a wonderful reflection, almost like a mirror. Notice how many newspapers are called the Daily Mirror. They reflect our imperfections like a mirror. And I think the American newspaper really only begins to be useful after it's been read. And if you have a canary, for instance, you'll understand what I mean. We like to use the society section. It's something. But here's an item that I bring to you of rather scholarly nature. At the meeting of the American Psychological Association, Dr. Frederick Wyatt, who is on the staff of the McLean Hospital, Waverly, Massachusetts, declared, quotes, "All women, without exception, have a dream lover," close quotes. Now this, of course, was in Massachusetts, probably doesn't apply to California. But I wrote some tender lines called Sweet Dreams. "If when you waken from your dream, you look at me, my dear, and scream, I'll not be frightened, not insist you visit a psychiatrist, but rather, understanding now, I'll hold your hand and stroke your brow. Return to dreams of love divine, and let me, please, go back to mine." You might wonder what kind of, before I leave this subject, I must bring you one other thing having to do with probably the sex capital, not in Denmark now, but in this country, Hollywood. Our export of films is beginning to compare with the best from Denmark. But it's the rating system that intrigues me. And I wrote some lines about the rating system for films. Films rated X for adults are fitted, with no one under 18 admitted. I now propose for the over 30, films rated Y that are really dirty. And a rating of Z, movies steeped in sin, the very ultimate. No one gets in. Now you might wonder what kind of reaction you get from readers to this kind of writing. I can show you this very quickly. Some years ago, before I learned about writing some lines in front of other lines, I wrote and left as a couplet 2 lines in Look magazine, which is not very pornographic or prurient. It was reprinted also in the Reader's Digest, which again isn't scatological. So these lines really are quite harmless. But a reader wrote something in rejoinder to these lines. I was on a TV show and read my original lines and the reader's lines, and this was all cut out in editing the show, and NBC said it wasn't fit for television. I thought it'd be all right for the students of UCLA. Now, what I had written originally were these 2 lines. You won't understand, they're so subtle, I'm sure you won't understand them. But apparently the readers of Look and the Reader's Digest, really high-level people, understood this. Called Guessing Game, it's hard to know what to deduce from girls who wear their sweaters loose. See, you don't understand it, I know. But after this appeared, I received a letter from the dean of Swarthmore College. As you know, a very respectable institution on the East Coast with a Quaker Friends background. He said he liked my 2 lines, which reassured me no end. But he said he thought they were incomplete. And he'd written 2 other lines he wished I would add. And his 2 lines were, "You can't be sure you're always right, even when they wear them tight." So that shows you the difference between a professor and a dean. Because I wouldn't have written a thing like that unless I'd thought of it. You might also be interested to know that this man is no longer dean of Swarthmore College. He's now a college president. Shows if you have a mind like that in the field of education, there's no stopping it. Well, I want to give you one other news item, and then I'll turn to something else. Racing the clock. This item, I think, tells us a great deal about ourselves and our imperfections, our likes and dislikes, maybe. One of the weirdest I think I've run on in some time. A dentist offers to color your teeth pearl, blue, or pink to give you an unforgettable smile. I wrote some lines called In Living Color. I can't decide, now let me think, do I want pearl or blue or pink? Pearl has a certain snob appeal, and folks might ask me, are they real or are they cultured? Pearl becomes, yet pink, you know, would match my gums. Yes, pink would be a pretty color. Most other hues would seem much duller. But then again, of course, there's blue, a color that I'm partial to, in shirts and ties and suits and such. Blue teeth might lend a special touch. But these might soon be out of date. Why not have teeth that alternate? One pearl, one pink, one blue in order, each with perhaps a yellow border. Then when I flashed a dazzling smile, I'd be remembered quite a while. I want to get away from the verse to the prose at the end of this very quickly, but I've got to do one other thing with regard to the verse. I think there's a very strong strain or vein of irreverence in the American people. I think more than any other place I've ever been, and more today than ever. There's a tendency to pull down whatever has been overpraised or lifted too high, including maybe even the flag on occasion. In my own field, in English, field I seem to have left to write in history and paleontology and a few other things that interest me more, I've practiced irreverence on the very authors I've loved and taught and built up. I did this, for instance, in Twisted Tales from Shakespeare and in the Classics Reclassified, American Lit Relit, English Lit Revit, and so on. But now here's a quick way to show you some irreverence as practiced on some of the great and near great poets. This is the way I started this some years ago. I started taking, say, the first 3 lines of a quatrain by a famous poet. Well-known line, it must be a well-known line. I quote them exactly as the poet wrote them, and then I write a line of my own at the end. And it's the incongruity between the poet's lines and mine that make the difference. Take Longfellow, famous line. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing, leave behind us things unpaid for, bought on time. Or take those virile lines of Henley, the Victorian Henley, Invictus. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be, I have not stumbled in a hole. Aren't those beautiful last lines? They're tremendous. Not a one of them in Bartlett yet. Tennyson's romantic lines. Tennyson's romantic lines, at least romantic for a Victorian. Come into the garden, Maud, for the black bat night has flown. Come into the garden, Maud, don't bring a chaperone. Now, more recently, I have refined this technique, if refined is the right word for it, and got it down to 2 lines. 1 line from the great poet, 1 line from me. 50-50. We share the blame, the other fellow's dead. Now, these come very quickly, so you have to be ready for them. I won't go through all the work I did to find lines that have just the soaring greatness that I can pull quickly to the gutter. For instance, Thomas Moore, the Irish poet and friend of Byron, his line often set to music. Believe me, if all those endearing young charms were removed from your bracelet, I might see your arms. Or Coleridge in the rhyme The Ancient Mariner. Water, water everywhere. The plumbing badly needs repair. Or Omar Khayyam, as translated by Edward Fitzgerald, a marvelous source for this material. A jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou. I'm not so very hungry anyhow. And in the same poem, The same poem, the moving finger writes, and having writ, is badly stained with ink, you must admit. Edna St. Vincent Millay, the greatest of our women poets. My candle burns at both ends. Where can I set it down, my friend? I'm glad you all have a good visual imagination, because that's the sloppiest scene in all American literature. But we mustn't neglect Shakespeare. Just one from The Tempest, finally. Full fathom 5, thy father lies. I pushed him, I apologize. Let me turn very quickly now to the prose side, and a book that did more for me, or, well, I'll put it another way. I think the book that did the greatest thing that can ever be done for a teacher. It ultimately enabled me to stop teaching. And that's It All Started with Columbus, which many of you may have read, but, oh, you do know it. But you may not know something, almost no one seems to know this, something about that book, what I was trying to do. It's a triple parody. It's a parody on 3 levels, none of them any too high. The first level is a parody of a history book. And I tried to give a clue to what I was doing on the title page of that book. And you may know that I put after my name my degrees. Now the first one is right, A.B., but then I put C.D.E.F. Now you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, how many people have written me, and they know from the C.D. I'm a chiropractor. But they say, what is your E.F.? One person even said, could it be flunked engineering? And I thought of putting G.H. on the next books which I was still studying. But they would have probably taken that for good housekeeping, so I gave it up. Well, so the first level of parody is a book, history textbook, title page, footnotes, glossary, appendices, and so on. Now the second level has to do with the people who use these books, the teachers. I got at them through the questions. And I want to show you, I have straight questions, multiple choice, true, false, all the other fiendish varieties. But I want to show you what I was trying to do, and just one of them, the simplest one. In the first test on the colonial period, what I did was simply this. It's a good deal like what I did with the poems, which is made a book finally called Punctured Poems, famous first and infamous second lines. But what I did here was again to get incongruity by quoting a question just as a teacher would ask it, and then adding just a little bit, enough to push it over the cliff. Now, the first question on the first test is simply this. Why do you think Columbus was so interested in traveling to distant places? What else do you know about his home life? Simple as that. Or, you know, teachers like to ask a question in which they say, what would you say about something? So we have one of those. What would you say about the Puritans? Would you say the same if they were listening? And then we have a map question, traced on a map the voyages of Henry Hudson. Use a solid line to show where he went, and a dotted line to show where he thought he was going. The third level of parody is more complicated, and I haven't time to go into it, but that has to do with the people who write these books, the scholars and historians, and I play with their cliches, turning points, and so on in that. But let me turn from that to European history, or rather to cultural history or Western civilization. As students, I know, students love to say syllables. I mean, never professors, prof, gymnasium, gym, on and on. I don't know what they do with all these syllables they say, but they've been hoarding them. You get 5.5% interest or something else. But this is Western civilization, which students call Western Civ, which is all right with me. I spell it S-I-E-V. It goes right through them. But let's look for just a quick glimpse. Let's look at cultural history in Europe, just a matter of the men in Greek statues. They're invariably clad in the simple, severely classical fig leaf, considered correct for daytime wear, but a little cool in the evening. The art of wearing a fig leaf without suspenders was lost with the Greeks. And when you there's a picture in here, by the way, to help you out. when you realize that this was before the invention of Scotch tape. And so far as I know, they didn't even have thumbtacks. You can see the heights to which Greek civilization has raised itself. Now, turning to literature, I think it's a great compliment to an author to be parodied. He must be well known. He must have certain individuality of style. There's no use parodying an unknown or rather commonplace person. I think the only poet worthy of a book-length parody is Shakespeare, and I did it in the Twisted Tales from Shakespeare. Now, this is a parody not just of Shakespeare, but of the Shakespearean scholars. I taught Shakespeare at undergraduate and graduate levels and spent my life reading Shakespeare, but I never got as close to Shakespeare as I did here, where I was getting right down to the word. As I've read these books, the kind I'm parodying, where you have about 6 or 7 of the well-known plays with a general introduction about Shakespeare's life, the Elizabethan theater, appendices about the authorship of the plays, about the sonnets and narrative poems. As I read these, I kept coming across this phrase in the introduction about Shakespeare's life. His mother was of gentle birth, and I could hardly wait to get at it. And all I wrote was this: his mother was of gentle birth, but his father, who came of yeoman stock, was born the hard way. I don't know what that is, but if you got one or the other. Looks pretty bad to me. But if you want to see the kind of line of Shakespeare that lingers with me, that I sum up when I'm discouraged and quote and I feel all right again, I can go ahead. It comes in one of the questions on Macbeth, where I say this: comment on the following quotation. Aroint thee, witch, the rump-fed Runyon cries. Isn't that a beautiful, inspirational thing? I go on to say, aroint thee, witch, the rump-fed Runyon cries. Discuss the advantages of rump-fed over spoon-fed and intravenous. Now, so far, and I could go into a lot of things. I've done 2 satires on education. One is Going Around in Academic Circles, which is dedicated to Socrates, the first professor to drink himself to death. And then a diabolical dictionary of education out more recently, which goes from kindergarten to graduate school, and I dedicate that to teaching, the second oldest profession. But leaving that aside, let me give you something that is satire rather than humor, or satire with this acid mixed with alkaline. This mostly has been pretty lighthearted humor with touches of satire perhaps. But it all started with Stones and Clubs is a Swiftian satire in the manner of a modest proposal. It's irony. It says one thing and means the other. Swift was my model, not in the subject matter, not about the starving Irish children, but on the history of war and weaponry. An interesting thing about this book is that while it's a satire on war and weaponry, it is currently required reading in the first year at West Point. You'll hardly believe that, but the reason is that in 147 pages, it's the complete history of all the battles, conquerors, weapons, and so on. One of my books in the bibliography, which I'm sure they wouldn't want to read, is Der Krieg, which is 6 volumes of German, classic work on war. But let me show you another technique that I haven't used at all so far. I've been using verse or prose, a lot of wordplay, and so on. This is the opening, if you haven't seen it, of It All Started with Stones and Clubs. Back in the Stone Age, man was too uncivilized and unimaginative to wage war. All he did was eat and sleep and try to keep warm. Stone Age man was very little above the animal. Footnote here, in fact, when animals were in trees, he was below the animal, which made him uneasy. Fortunately for his status, animals did not wage war either, so man did not develop an inferiority complex. Unlike man, animals never progressed to the point of making war. This is one reason why animals have remained animals, and over the centuries have lagged so far behind man. Not only was man too uncivilized to wage war during the Stone Age, but he had no reason to do so. He had no desire to take territory away from other men, since he had more territory and more stones than he could possibly use. He had no desire to take anything away from anybody else, because every man had roughly the same things: a rough, cold cave, a rough, cold wife, and an empty stomach. He did not declare war when someone came bounding over his boundary because there were no boundaries. There were not even any walls or barbed wire, border guards or customs officials. He did not declare war out of dislike for someone else's ideology because everyone had the same ideology, which was try to stay alive if you can. He did not wage war to save national honor because there were no nations and there was no honor. Nor did he wage war to save face, face at that time being only the front of the head, and in no danger of being lost unless the whole head was. He was not stimulated to declare war by reading books or newspapers or hearing over the radio or TV about what people on the other side were planning to do to him if he didn't do it to them first. In fact, there was no other side. This shows how primitive man was. Had man remained in this unhappy condition, there would have been no fortunes made through the manufacture of munitions, no memoirs ghost-written for generals, no heroes, no medals, no war orphans, no national cemeteries. There would be no veterans' benefits, no veterans' hospitals. There'd be no victory monuments, and pigeons would have to find some other place. The situation was intolerable. Fortunately, man took things into his own hands. The first thing he took into his own hands was either a club or a stone. He may even have had a club in one hand and a stone in the other, an early instance of overkill. The club and the stone were the first offensive weapons. The first defensive weapon was the skull, rapidly followed by the defensive club and the defensive stone. I'm getting pretty technical here. These were approximately the same size and shape as the offensive club and the offensive stone. An important factor in early warfare was the cave. The person in the cave had the advantage over anyone entering the cave because his eyes were accustomed to the darkness. Once dark glasses were invented, this advantage no longer existed. But primitive man had no dark glasses. In fact, he had no glasses of any kind. And this deprived him, if he had bad eyesight, of the opportunity of having his vision corrected to the standard that made him eligible for killing other people. When on the defensive, it also cost him the delay gain while saying, wait till I take my glasses off, during which time his opponent might get out of the notion. The earliest armed conflicts were probably between two men. Casualties were heavy, usually about 50%. Now, I'm going to stop at that point because I want to conclude and give 5 minutes maybe for questions. If you can stay that long, if you can't, you can go. But let me tell you what we've been doing. I have tried to give you a little idea of the difference between humor and satire, difference between light verse and poetry, the imperfections of man that I'm glad we have to give us individuality, that I think we have to learn to coexist with. We've looked a bit at a variety of things, at money and colored teeth and little history and little literature and little war. That's quite a bit in the time I've had. Now I want to conclude, as I should always conclude perhaps, with the most conclusory thing I have. This is a news item again, going back to what I started with, giving a sense of order to all this, a beginning, middle, and end. This is the item. A speaker at a meeting of the Frozen Food Locker Association said that in the event of an atomic explosion, a frozen food locker is the best hiding place because radiation rays won't penetrate. I wrote 8 short, definitive lines suitable for carving on our collective tomb and or shelter, called hiding place. Move over, ham and quartered cow. My Geiger says the time is now. Yes, now I lay me down to sleep, and if I die, at least I'll keep.
Okay, we can take as many questions that we have time for until the other class moves in on us. Yes, right there. Could you stand up, please?
You can't comment on Ogden Nash.
Would I comment on Ogden Nash? Well, he wrote the foreword to one of my recent books, so I think he's a great guy. I might say on his technique of using, what he does, you know, is to give a long line and a rhyme, and you wait a long way until another line comes. For instance, the line is, I want an 88-piece orchestra led by Kusevitsky. Now, what's the rhyme? And he says, I don't want the ownership of it, I just want the Usavitsky, you see. This is his technique, and he's developed it. But I must say, if you go back in literature, you'll find the technique was used before. Byron used it in Don Juan with some extraordinary rhymes and made-up rhymes. And Phyllis McGinley, more recently, copied it perhaps. She has a rhyme of sandwiches about a picnic. It's sandwiches and bandwiches, you see. It's being done. It's been, Arthur Gitterman used to do it, but Nash has perfected it, and I would say it's his technique now. We've had very good relationships for over 30 years, and I think very highly of him. Yes. Yes, I can't, you can hear me, but I can't. What's that? On Art Bookvault, I seem so far to be liking everybody because Bookvault, I think, does a great service. His is more, see, Nash is almost straight humor. It's not satire. There's not hardly a trace of satire in Nash. But some social commentary, not very much. It's on the human being, sort of thing I started out with, and human imperfections. But Art Bookvault is a satirist, not as sharp and not as narrow politically as, say, Mort Saul or Pfeiffer or other people. But I think one good thing about him is that he has a loose political stance. Now, some of you may disagree with me, but I think it's very important for a satirist to keep a loose political stance so that if he sees absurdity, bigotry, whatever it is, this side or that, he can take it up, you see. But if he gets right in here and everything right around him is all right, he's terribly limited. I think he must especially see it in his own party, his own group, and himself. And Bookvault does pretty well at taking care of all groups there. I'm glad, I think he helps our national sanity to be coming out 3 times a week in over 400 papers. Yes.
Is there any type of satirism you don't approve of?
That I don't approve of? Well, I hinted a little bit on the Mort Saul. Now, I was on a TV show just after Mort Saul, and I made this comment and found the commentator was a close friend of Mort Saul, which didn't help me, the MC. But I do think Mort Saul has worked himself into a narrow political stance. That's all I'd say, because it's fairly obvious now what he's going to attack. I would like to keep a stance so nobody knows what I'm going to attack next. And I try to do that. I wrote political satire for a paper in New York every week for 21 years. And I think I'm willing to have anybody, in fact, it was collected in the book, I'll stand by anything I said in those years, 1941 to 62. And I think I have a basic sameness. That is, the bigots, the people who are absurd, over-emotional, all these things. I see them today and I saw them 20, 30 years ago. I don't care whether Republicans, Democrats, right or left. I'm dealing with the type or with the quality. And this is the one thing I would say, I know some contemporary so-called satirists who I think have limited themselves too much and have become more propagandists for a single point of view than satirists of humanity. Yes. I think what needs most satire in this country, and it's getting it, I think, pretty well, is government, is politics. This is where man, I think, shows his greatest absurdity. I love an election year. People are just a little crazier on election year. And the 2 main parties are only exceeded by a 3rd party, usually. They're a wonderful game, usually. But no, I think we're doing it. Now, we get cut down a great deal about we can't do this and can't do that. There are all kinds of restrictions. Don't forget what you can find on recordings. I heard a recording just night before last about some of our governmental people. If you'd done the same thing in almost any country now, England maybe, France maybe, few places. I know lots and lots of places, and I've been there and I've lectured there, where you could no more play that record, sell it, distribute it, what it says in there. And I happen to agree with the record, I was fine. But I do think, as I mentioned about Crocodile and so on, we are free. We're limited on TV because of sponsors. We're limited in newspapers, magazines, but we have areas, notably on recordings. There are areas where we are absolutely unbound, and I think more so than any place in the world. Yes.
Someone once said that tragedy is generally a universal thing, but that comedy is highly restricted according to the time. Do you feel, particularly in the United States, that one, humor has changed, or that is the point that humor has changed, or is it simply become polarization of taste?
Well, this is a long question. I'll try to give a quick answer about the fact that tragedy is universal and so on. Comedy is limited maybe into place and time. And how about America right now? I think there's a book called The Rise and Fall of American Humor, done by a man at the English professor at the University of Montana, which I reviewed. I had much correspondence with him. I said he'd have to write 2 books to cover with the thoroughness he did Mark Twain and a few people, the whole subject of humor in America. We finally agreed after several letters that it would take 4 volumes anyhow to do it. It's a long and complicated subject. The book is called The Rise and Fall of American Humor. Now, I argued with him over the title. The rise is perfectly okay. We started at 0. Some people think it's usually said the Puritans came to this country to escape religious persecution. I think they were the most humorless people in England, and they were shipped out. And that's where we started. So we started at 0. It had to be the rise, but fall. I would call it the rise and fall and rise and fall and rise and fall and rise and fall. It's an undulating history, or the rise and change. There has been a great change, but that change I could duplicate in Mark Twain's life and writings himself. Mark Twain went from good-humored humor to very bitter humor, black humor, all the things we hear of today. You study Mark Twain and you'll see in a microcosm our own development or change. This is a very quick answer to a complicated question. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I think so. Just as in the movies, you look at the big success of Love Story, and I think there's going to be a switch there when you get tired of nudity, when you've seen one, you've seen them all. I think there's going to be a change there. I think there'll be a change back maybe to a Benchley type or Thurber type. These people are still read a great deal. And some of our sick humorists, they're in the hospital now. They're sick, yeah. Yes. Yes. Well, it'd have to be a contemporary writer, an old one. Mention was made of my lecturing abroad for the government, and last spring I lectured, I hit Berlin just when the Cambodian thing started, so I had 2 weeks of walking on broken glass. I had so much broken glass on my left shoe sole that I squeaked everywhere I went. But I lectured in Bad Godesberg, where our embassy is in Germany. I had a session for some days with 30 young teachers of English in the Realschule and like high school and junior high school. And they assigned me the job beforehand of interpreting to them Mark Twain and notably Huckleberry Finn. I would say that there's no book that says more about the generation gap, about hypocrisy of elders and honesty of the young, uneducated types, than Huckleberry Finn. No, I think Huckleberry Finn, to me, is the great American book, and I think it says something then, and it still says something to our immediate problems. Of course, I can go back to Chaucer and show you how relevant, to use your favorite word, how relevant Chaucer is to today, or the 14th century is to the 20th. There's nothing really that's irrelevant in my world. Yes. I think if anybody wants to go, and I guess somebody else comes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm engaged in what's called, I have to know quite a bit about what I'm satirizing. Absolutely right. And that's why my readers, the ones who know Shakespeare, say, or whatever, enjoy these books. I'm writing really for students, above all, and literate people. A history book. I use 4 libraries, and I don't know how many history books. I'm involved in what's now called continuing education. I'm still learning. And I love to take a brand new subject, and then for instance, I did 2 children's books on prehistoric animals. I didn't even take geology in college. But when I got through these books, I had a pretty good education in them. I went to the Pomona College Geology Library on the first book, A Dozen Dinosaurs. I spent 8 months in that. Often in the library, I was the only person. I don't know what the students do, but I was studying prehistoric animals, the Mesozoic period. I never heard of it before, And, yeah. Well, a book like that wasn't too bad because, you know, the history is you can get a pretty good guide there. I used other history books, but I've spent all the way from my record as a juvenile book I wrote in 6 days, but that was out of imagination, out of the books. On the other hand, my extreme one is one I spent 6 years on, a biography. That was in the publish or perish phase of my life, and I wasn't going to perish. And I almost perished in the cold of the British Museum, but I got through that. So, but normally I begin a book in my schedule is to begin a book in February that is going to come out in a year from the next fall. So it's almost 2 years. But that's not all writing. It's writing, revising, waiting for my editor to tell me what to do, and then finally, after all the revisions, then there are all the proof and waiting, illustrations, waiting, so on. There's as much waiting as anything else. Therefore, I usually have 2 books going. I usually write a juvenile and an adult book at the same time. I've been doing 2 books and 3 a year lately. I have 2 finished for next year now. Yes.
Let's just...
Yeah, we want to do... You tell, what do you want?
Yeah, I just want to say that let's just take one more question. Then
all right. Gee, there's so many. I wish you used to hire me here. I'll come. I'll teach. I'll teach. Good. Thank you. I guess that's as good as an offer. Yeah, your question. Oh, that wasn't history of war. I was in Columbus, the third level. Stones and Clubs, yeah. Well, I didn't put that in 3 levels. I think it's only really the Columbus and Europa, American history and European history has the 3 levels of the text satirizing or parodying the textbook, the teacher, and the scholar who writes them. Stones and Clubs is a completely different technique. It's, I say, is an irony. It's saying one thing and meaning the other. And let me say, by the way, you might say instantly, everybody's against war. But I found a quotation to use in my acknowledgement that shows this isn't true. I was in Hong Kong. I'd given up any idea of dedicating this book to anybody. Publisher said, do you want to leave a page for dedication or acknowledgement? I had nobody to thank or acknowledge on this. I had a bibliography in it. Then in Hong Kong, a Chinese friend, and this was now about, when I wrote this, three years ago, I guess, and I had not looked at Mao Zedong's little red book, but he had a copy. And he gave it to me, and I read it I put it away and didn't read it till we were late 5 hours of getting into Yugoslavia. I was lecturing at the University of Belgrade. We were up all night on this plane, and I finally, in desperation, pulled out the little red book, and I got this. I wired my publisher and said, save me a page, because this is the acknowledgement. I am indebted to Chairman Mao Zedong for his inspiring statement, quote, war is the highest form of struggle for resolving contradictions. That fits my book perfectly. Only he wasn't ironical, I don't think. I think we'll have to quit. What we do from here on is that I'll be here, and we can, if somebody else, another class comes or something, I'll get outside, and if you don't have a class, we'll stand around and talk. Thank you very much.